Welcome back, everybody. And this is how we're going to start our third episode um, concerning ourselves with the topic of slavery. We're going to begin here, in which I think most people could recognize as a cotton field. So, why, Mr. Neds, are you talking about why a cotton field? Why cotton? Why cotton in the story of slavery? And I imagine everybody that at least remembers just common knowledge about the history of slavery in this particular country in the United States, the role, the incredible role that cotton played in entrenching, fortifying, and extending the practice of slavery in this country. So let me talk to you a little bit about the history of cotton. It first of all, it's been around for a very long time. It's a Cotton is a, as you can see, it's a plant. It's a fibrous plant, and the fibers of the bulb, if you will, flower, for lack of a better term, are picked, and those fibers are spun and woven into cotton fabric. Cotton is very much a part of our lives today. I'm willing to bet that the sheets on your bed and the clothes on your back, if not 100%, at least in part, are are made with cotton. Cotton has come to be the most commonplace, affordable, you know, most commonly found textile in the world. But if I told you that was not always the case? What if I told you that once upon a time cotton was a luxury fabric? A luxury fabric. The very wealthy could afford it. And that was because of the amount of painstaking, detailed work involved in what they called cleaning cotton. At the very center of the bulb, there's a series of little tiny black seeds and thorns. And the people whose job was to clean cotton had to, by hand, remove the clean white fibers from the center of the bulb and avoid the little black seeds and particularly the little thorns, for lack of a better term, that would prick your fingers and then you would bleed and you would ruin the cotton. So it took people all day to do this incredibly detailed work, and in the end, a rather modest amount of cotton was cleaned. And the way supply and demand works, if this fabric is comfortable and breathable and everybody wants it, but because of its nature, a limited amount can be produced, well, the price is going to be very high. It's going to be a luxury fabric. And that's the way it was for a very long time. And then this guy comes around. Inventor Eli Whitney, possibly the most famous of his inventions, is what they called the cotton gin, short for cotton engine. Eli Whitney invented a contraption, and the patent goes all the way back to the 1790s, if I'm not mistaken, that would allow you to put unclean cotton fiber in one compartment. And by turning a crank, you essentially spun a series of bristles that would comb through the cotton, and in doing so, automatically separate the seeds and the thistles from the fiber. What Mr. Whitney ended up inventing was a much more effective and practical way of cleaning cotton. Now, what used to be only be what was only possible to produce a very small amount because of the amount of painstaking, detailed manual labor involved, now the amount processed could literally explode. Thanks to Whitney's cotton gin, the amount of cotton that can be cleaned now, well, much more than before, and it's a high demand fabric. So to anybody in the cotton business or entertaining getting into the cotton business, high demand, high volume, you stand to make a fortune. You stand to make a fortune. But the question we should be asking is, how did Mr. Whitney's invention, who some say was born out of altruistic reasons, to make work in life a little bit easier for those unfortunate souls whose job it was to clean cotton, make life a little bit easier for them, and how does he end up opening a Pandora's box, particularly for those folks that are enslaved in the United States? And remember, the last time we spoke, there was a hope that after the 1808 moratorium and the end of importation, whatever population existed at the time, not being fueled with new bodies, would eventually dwindle and dwindle and dwindle and come to an end. And then this guy's invention changes all that. Curious thing is, the patent goes all the way back to the 1790s, but it's going to take a while before that technology can be put to use at an industrial scale and is available and affordable throughout the country. And when that happens, everything changes. When you get industrial cotton gins, everything changes. And now, the cash crops that used to fuel slave profits in the 1700s, even the early 1800s, tobacco, indigo, what have you, are now going to be quickly replaced by a much more lucrative crop. Thus begins the era of King Cotton. And it's not an exaggeration. Cotton would come to fuel an incredible amount of wealth in this country. Played a huge role in building the American economy. Cotton became the #1 export of the United States, but we're going to talk about that later. This is how cotton goes from being a luxury fabric to being a common everyday fabric. And don't think that it only benefited the southern economy. The northern economy, with its textile mills, bought cotton, bought slave-produced cotton. I don't want you to think that slave labor exclusively and only benefited the economy of the South. The North is tied to this too. They may not have directly enslaved anyone, but they bought slave-produced cotton, and that encouraged the continued existence of slavery in the South. They bought slave-produced cotton, and they spun it, and they wove it into cotton fabric, and they sold it as reams of fabric, and they sold it as finished garments, and they profited it off of slave-produced cotton. They profited off of slave labor just as well. Maybe not as directly, but they did. And if we look at the big picture, the entire country economically benefited off of slave labor. Whether they were the traffickers, whether they were the traders, whether they were the slavers themselves, okay, or whether they were the owners of the textile mills and the sellers of fabric and garments, all up and down the line. You had folks that fed off this food chain and benefited from slave labor, particularly the slave labor that took off with the invention of the cotton gin, because now there would be no diminishing of slavery. If anything, now it was going to explode because there was a newfound demand for slavery, particularly across the South. And thus the country continues its march in two directions. The South expands westward. Cotton drives much of that expansion. More and more land devoted to this cash crop. The Southern economy begins to take a particular shape, almost completely devotes itself to this cash crop. It becomes an export economy, like many export economies that exist in the world today. Meaning what? Meaning they made the economic decision to not actually produce anything themselves. Just grow cotton, for the most part. Cotton, 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 cotton. that we're going to make so much money off of cotton that we'll just use that money to buy everything else we need. So we have an economy that's incredibly dependent on exporting cotton. And because of that, likewise dependent on both the North and European markets to provide their manufactured goods. Right? Dependent on exports and dependent on imports from elsewhere. And it even gets crazy when you talk about, well, what about agricultural goods? You would think with all this land, this wonderfully fertile land in great conditions, they even gave priority to cotton had more priority than food. And then you're going to get these crazy stories during the Civil War about starvation in the South. But how could it be? Because they dedicated practically everything to cotton. And the North, long abandoning the prospect of having a purely agricultural economy, already heading towards industrialization, textile factories being the first examples of this, went in a different direction, but still benefited nonetheless from cotton. You got people walking up and down the streets of Boston and London against the institution of slavery, and very likely wearing clothes that if you follow the path of that fabric, it takes you to a plantation in the South. So let's get deeper into the specific topic of American slavery, particularly the slavery that begins to take root, already existed, but begins to take root in a much more insidious way after the introduction of the cotton gin. 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, when more and more of the Southern economy turns towards cotton. Cotton production explodes, and because of this, the demand for slaves explodes as well. That's an iconic picture, by the way. I don't want to leave it. But that is a picture. We're going to talk about abolitionists later on in the class. These are folks that were activists, the social justice warriors of the mid-1800s. And this is one of the most famous pictures they used to use to bring awareness to the evils of slavery, because not everybody was aware of this. You have to understand, this was an era before television, before radio, before movies. A good percentage of people still didn't know how to read. So how do you get the word out? And many folks were inclined to believe that it wasn't that bad. That, in fact, on the contrary, it might have been normal. It might have been the natural order of things. Southern propagandists worked very hard to promote that point of view. If slavery was such a benign practice, then you have to explain that picture to those that would continue to buy into the fantasy that slavery was a benign practice. So here's a dilemma, right? Cotton all of a sudden is the new fever. Everybody that owns land in the South wants to get in on cotton. Southerners want to expand the country west to expand cotton. It's pouring millions of dollars into the U.S. economy. But you can't import slaves from Africa anymore. This is an image of the domestic slave trade. And I already told you last time, step one, any slaves that remain in the North, and there wouldn't have been, the process of selling them southward throughout the early 1800s. Selling them to the South because, frankly, the Southern landowner had more use for them, was willing to pay top dollar. But how do you expand upon those numbers? So after the moratorium, the only slave trade that exists is an internal one. And it's mostly northern states selling their slaves south. Selling their slaves to the South until eventually they don't have any. But the numbers are still not enough. So how do you increase even more number? There's going to be a legal slave trade? Sure. They used to call these folks contraband. You would get in trouble, if you will. But they were smuggled in the country anyway. The answer to that question is pretty awful, and I really hate to speak of human beings in these terms. It accelerated the effort to have people that were slaves to procreate. And I don't like to refer to people, human beings, as being part of a breeding program. But that's exactly what happened. That's exactly how they were able to meet the demand with the absence of importation. When the North had no longer any more slaves to sell, when no more slaves were being imported, then the emphasis became using slaves to create more slaves by deliberately breeding people with characteristics that they felt were conducive to greater productivity in the world of manual labor. And that was very much done on purpose to expand their numbers. Perhaps that's the reason why we end up with the largest population of people of African descent by the time we get to 1860. And we're going to look at some figures a little bit later. And in the popular imagination of Americans, when they think about slavery, this is what they envision. Slavery as it revolved around cotton. But I want you to understand that only became true and more true as we approached the 1850s, as more and more landowners steered their land towards cotton. Planting, tending to the fields to make sure, pests or plant disease did not take root, weeds, harvesting. I don't know how many times a year cotton was harvested. In the winter months, what happened? Repairs and maintenance to the estate. Some slaves were trained in handicrafts, carpenters, things of that nature, and they were hired out to folks that needed people with that particular skill. And I'm not going to go into the detailed intricacies of the slave community on a particular plantation. On top of the fact that the Hollywood representation, anytime Hollywood talks about slavery in the U.S. at this time, it's always the same setting. A large plantation with dozens, if not hundreds, of slaves. And not that that didn't happen, but that was the rarest of exceptions. The most common arrangement, if that family were to be a slave owning family, would be anywhere from 1 to 2 to 4, 5, 6, a family. That was the norm among slave owning families. The large sprawling estate, the planter's estate, was actually a rarity. But it may be an easier vehicle to use to describe the nature of slavery in this country. So these are illustrations that pretty much illustrated, an awful reality. People stripped of their humanity, stripped of their identity, reduced to property, codified in law, upheld and enforced to produce wealth for a minority of people in the South. Oh, well, it's producing wealth for a lot of people, whether directly or indirectly. As demand for cotton grew, the South's needs for more slaves grew as well. Eventually, we get to 4 million by the time we get to 1860. And also look at that bar chart. Cotton as a percentage of all exports. 7% in 1800, 32 in 1820, 52 in 1840, and by 1860, practically 60% of U.S. exports were cotton. And the vast majority of that cotton heading to Great Britain, to the textile factories of Great Britain. So even that far away, you had folks profiteering off of slave labor. I took this picture in the National Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C. Just some figures here and get into some of the math. Um, Apparently, slaves, cotton and slaves were bought and sold as financial instruments. Europeans even bought stocks in slaves. They bought stocks in slaves and they bought stocks in cotton as well. It says here over $2.5 million. Banks issued credit based on the collateral of slaves. 25 million, $26 million in bank credits issued to landowners who mortgaged their slaves in return for that money. It's much more sophisticated than just owning slaves. Insurance companies were in on this. Banks lent money on this. People invested into the slave economy. $250 million, the value of cotton produced by enslaved Americans in 1861. In 1 year, look how much slave labor injected into the American economy. $3 billion, the value assigned to enslaved African Americans in 1860. I think these are adjusted numbers to a more current currency. I'm going to give you a little fun fact. If the market value of all 4 million slaves in the country at the time was over $3 billion, it actually would have cost the federal government less money, substantially less money, to simply purchase the freedom of every single slave than the amount of money the federal government spent on the Civil War. Let's look at some maps. By the time we get to the 1800s, as you can see, cotton has replaced. Slavery is not only spread westward, but cotton is the dominant cash crop. 55% of cash crops in this country are produced by cotton. You still got Virginia with tobacco. The upper South is about the only part of the South that is still dominated by food crops. But as you can see, and Louisiana is very interesting. When you get to South Louisiana, around the Gulf Coast, sugar and rice, if I'm not mistaken. But cotton, this image makes it indisputable. Now we're going to get some really interesting figures. Well, all white people owned slaves. Okay, no, they didn't. Slavery was confined to the South. Okay, all white Southerners owned slaves. No, they didn't. Slaves were a rather expensive investment. Okay, pretty much the only people that found themselves on the financial footing to even think about buying a slave were people that owned land. And the majority of Southerners didn't. I am not letting them off the hook. We're going to get back to them later. The majority of Southerners, we're even going to say half, were poor and had no land. Quite often, living in conditions very similar conditions, and having very similar jobs to the slaves that live in the South. But there is a huge difference. They had freedom. They had agency. They had rights as per law. The law protected their rights. They had the right to get up and go. They had agency. They had certain privileges, rights, opportunities open to them because of the color of their skin that slaves did not. So maybe they were not the slave owners per se, but they did enjoy benefits above others, namely slaves, by being white in a slave society. 64% of the population did not own slaves, could not afford to. They were poor. The South had a large percentage of its people that lived in poverty. Okay? But let's talk about those slave owners. Add them all together, and what we're looking at, something like 30 something percent. Figures I have here, something like 32% of the population owned slaves. But let's look at those pie slices a little bit more carefully. 18% owned slaves. Look, it doesn't matter how many slaves you own. You're still denying somebody, okay, the most basic right of dignity and free will. Whether it's, you do so in very, very large numbers or not. But the vast majority of people own 5 or less slaves, perhaps a family. The way they saw it, they were being altruistic. They had a family live on their land. They took care of that family in exchange for that family's labor. 15% of slave owners owned somewhere between 5 and 50 slaves. So now we're getting into larger numbers. And 2.5% of the slave-owning population owned 50 or more slaves, fell into the category that you could call the planter class, the wealthiest of the wealthy. And that's because we decided to stop at 50. We would say from 100 and up, an even smaller percentage, something like 0.6% of the southern population had more than 100 slaves. These were the 1%ers of the American South. And they're the ones that set policy. They're the ones that dominated politics in the South. They're the ones that ultimately made the decision, let's go to war, because after all, they go to war to protect their benefits. And who benefits most from that practice is the one that's going to yell the loudest about having to protect it. Let's look at some data. Holdings of Southern slave owners by 1860. And I put that down there. If we look at the numbers, right? If we start, number of people across the South, slave owners, that had, I just mentioned this earlier, anywhere between 100 to 500 slaves. We are talking about 2,363 people. 2,363 planters out of a population of 9 million people, both slave and free, that basically were made the decisions in Southern society, both politically and economically. The wealthiest of the wealthy. You look at the other figures as well. At most, if you want to crunch all the numbers, you have something like 400,000 people out of a population of 9 million. 4 million being slave, 5 million being white freemen. 400,000 people owned any number of slaves. So what's the takeaway? Not even a majority of whites own slaves. Something like a third of the population. So a third of the population owns slaves. But those that didn't own slaves didn't mean they didn't defend and benefit from that practice or aspire to it. Okay? Slaves as a percent of the total population is another interesting bit of data to look at. And as you can see, South Carolina, by 1860, 57.18% of its population were slaves, the majority. Mississippi at 55%. And then you can look at the lower numbers there, like Delaware. That's why they got rid of it. Missouri, you want to find the states that eventually abandoned slavery and did not go with the Confederacy? Look at the states with the lowest numbers. As a percentage of the population, here you go. You could pause and look at that figure as well. Florida, 55% of the population was free, 41% of the population was slave. But South Carolina and Mississippi were the highest up there. If you squint here, You could differentiate between cotton production in 1820, a lot of it on that South Carolina Georgia border and along the Mississippi River. And then look what happens by 1860. It just blows up. From being concentrated in very specific spots, it blows up from Texas all the way to practically North Carolina, all across. That's called, by the way, that red strip of land you see there is called the Black Belt, also called the Cotton Belt. And there's a very good reason why cotton fields, the planting of cotton, took root in that particular strip of land. And the science tells us that millions and millions and millions of years ago, um, when the earth was warmer than it is today, that was the coast. And for who knows how long, marine life lived and died and nourished that ancient coastline, and then temperatures changed, the seas receded, and you ended up with an incredibly fertile strip of land. And on top of that fertile strip of land, cotton plantations. And if you're looking for the population of slaves, well, guess what? You're going to find them there too. In 1820, if you squint your eyes, most slaves are concentrated in Virginia and along the Georgia, South Carolina coast. It's kind of hard to tell, but by the time you get to 1860, they're spread out across the South along that strip of land. So that's our conversation for today. I think we got it to 31, 32 minutes. We still have to work on getting these a little bit shorter. Next time, we'll continue with a talk about territorial expansion.